The clink of ice against crystal was the only sound Leah allowed herself to focus on. It was a clean sound, a precise rhythm in the symphony of controlled chaos that was a Saturday night service at Aria. She moved between tables with an economy of motion that belied her frame, a silent dance she had perfected over 2 years of balancing trays heavy with seared scallops and Cabernet. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Julian, caught her arm as she passed the service station. Table 7, Leah. The private booth. Leah's eyes flickered toward the secluded alcove at the far end of the dining room, shrouded in shadow and discretion. That's Mr. Sterling's usual spot. Mr. Sterling cancelled, Julian said, his voice a low, tight wire. He was already sweating through his starched collar. This is a new client. Very important. Do not mess this up. She just nodded, smoothing the front of her black apron. Her competence was a quiet armor she wore every night.
She was good at this job.
She read tables, anticipated needs, and faded into the background, a ghost who kept the wine glasses full and the water chilled. As she approached the booth, the air grew colder, the ambient chatter of the restaurant seeming to fall away. 3 men sat within. 2 were flankers, built like brick walls in sharp, dark suits, their gazes sweeping the room with a predatory stillness. The man in the center was the source of the chill. He was carved from ice and shadow, his suit a blade of charcoal silk that fit his shoulders with surgical precision. His black hair was expertly styled, not a single strand out of place. He didn't look up as she approached, his attention fixed on the heavy tumbler in his hand. It was his hands she noticed first, long-fingered, immaculate, with a single, heavy gold ring on his right pinky. "Good evening," Leah said, her voice calm and even. "My name is Leah, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with something from our wine list, or perhaps some mineral water?" The man in the center still did not look at her. He spoke a single, sharp sentence in Korean to the man on his left. The words were unintelligible to her, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of dismissal. The man on the left, who had a thin scar bisecting his eyebrow, looked at Leah. His eyes raked over her, from her neatly tied hair down to her comfortable, practical shoes, lingering on the curve of her hips and the soft fullness of her arms. It was a professional assessment, cold and insulting. He turned back to his boss. "She seems capable enough." The words were in perfect, unaccented English. The boss finally lifted his head. His eyes were dark, a flat, polished obsidian that held no light and offered no warmth. They met hers for a fraction of a second, a glance so fleeting and dismissive it was more insulting than a stare. He looked her over, the same methodical path his soldier had taken, but his gaze felt heavier, like a physical weight. Then he looked away, back at his drink, and spoke to his man as if she were a piece of furniture. "Her presence is distracting. Unrefined. This is Aria, not a diner. Tell Julian to send someone else. Someone more appropriate for the table." The words hit her like a slap. Distracting. Unrefined. He hadn't called her fat. He didn't have to. The meaning was crystalline. She was not the right aesthetic for his world of sharp lines and cold, hard surfaces. She was too much. Too soft. A blemish on his carefully curated evening. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at the back of her throat. For a moment, her training faltered. She wanted to turn and walk away, to let Julian deal with this arrogant monster. But then, a different instinct took over. The same quiet stubbornness that got her through 12-hour shifts and microaggressions from patrons who thought a black woman couldn't possibly know the difference between a Burgundy and a Bordeaux. She would not be dismissed. She planted her feet, her posture straightening. "Is there a problem with the service, sir?" she asked, her voice dropping a fraction, losing its polite, professional lilt and gaining a quiet edge of steel. She directed the question to him, the man in the center, refusing to be relegated to an unheard third party. The 2 soldiers tensed. The boss, however, went utterly still. He slowly raised his eyes to meet hers again. This time, he held her gaze. There was a flicker of something in those dark depths, not anger, but surprise. He had expected her to scurry away in shame. He had not expected to be challenged, however, quietly. He was Kwon Ji-young, and people did not challenge him. He was about to speak, to utter the words that would have her fired before she could draw her next breath, when the world dissolved into glass and thunder. The floor-to-ceiling window behind their booth exploded inward, a glittering shockwave of shattering crystal. The serene ambience of Aria vanished, replaced by screams and the concussive, deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Leah's training, the years of handling hot plates and sharp knives, kicked in. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze.
She dropped.
Her body hit the plush carpet an instant before a spray of bullets stitched a line of destruction across the upholstered wall where her head had been. Chaos erupted. Patrons scrambled, overturning tables. His two men were already moving, drawing weapons from beneath their jackets with a fluid, terrifying grace. One kicked the heavy oak table onto its side, creating a makeshift barricade. Leah, pressed against the floor, found herself trapped in the booth with them. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and fear. She could hear the heavy, booted footsteps of the attackers entering the restaurant. Kwon Ji-young had not flinched. He moved with a chilling, deliberate calm, pulling a sleek, black pistol from a shoulder holster. He moved like the room owed him space. One of the attackers, clad in black tactical gear, rounded the corner of the overturned table. Ji-young's man took him down with 2 precise shots to the chest. But another was coming from the side, a blind spot. Leah saw him, saw the muzzle of his rifle lifting, aiming directly at the back of Ji-young's head. There was no time to think.
She acted.
Scrambling on her hands and knees, she grabbed the heaviest thing she could reach, a silver wine bucket, still full of ice, and a bottle of unopened champagne. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung it, low and hard, into the attacker's knee. The man roared in pain, his leg buckling. His shot went wide, blasting a chunk of plaster from the ceiling. The moment of distraction was all Ji-young needed. He pivoted, his movements impossibly fast, and fired once. The attacker dropped. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The attack had been swift, brutal, and focused. And now it was over. The surviving gunmen were gone. In the ringing quiet, Ji-young slowly lowered his weapon. He turned, not to his men, but to her. He looked at the wine bucket still clutched in her hands, then at her face. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. But her hands were steady. Her eyes were clear. He stared at her, and for the first time, the dismissive contempt in his gaze was gone. It was replaced by something else. Something sharp, calculating, and dangerously focused. He had looked at her before and seen a clumsy, unworthy servant. Now he saw a woman who had moved toward violence instead of away from it. A woman who had, in her own way, just saved his life. "Get up," he commanded, his voice a low growl. She pushed herself to her feet, her knees shaky. One of his men was already on a phone, speaking in rapid, hushed Korean. The other stood guard, weapons still drawn. "You're a witness," Ji-young stated. It wasn't an observation. It was a verdict. "They saw your face. They saw you with me." He took a step closer, crowding her against the ruined booth. The scent of him filled her senses. Expensive wool, cold steel, and a faint, clean note of bergamot. "You can't stay here. You're a liability." Before she could process his words, before she could protest, he took her arm. His grip was like iron, not painful, but absolute. He began to pull her toward the service exit, his men falling into formation around them. "Wait," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "My job, my life."
He didn't stop.
He glanced down at her, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers. "You don't have that life anymore," he said, the words as cold and final as a tombstone. "Your life is my problem now." That was the moment everything changed. She was no longer Leah, the competent waitress at Aria. She was a piece on Kwon Ji-young's chessboard, dragged from her world into the heart of his war. And as he pulled her out into the rain-slicked alley behind the restaurant, she knew with a terrifying certainty that he would never, ever let her go. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel overlooking the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city. For 3 days, Leah had paced its length, a prisoner in a gilded prison. Ji-young had installed her here with 2 of his silent, ever-present soldiers posted outside her door. He had provided clothes, impersonal, expensive silks and cashmeres that felt alien against her skin. He had provided food, exquisite meals she barely touched. What he had not provided was an explanation. He appeared on the 4th evening, moving into the vast living space with the same predatory silence she remembered from the restaurant. He had shed his suit jacket, and the white shirt he wore was open at the collar, revealing the sharp line of his collarbone and the faint hint of dark ink just visible on the side of his neck. "You are restless," he observed, pouring himself a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "I'm a prisoner," she shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. The fear had begun to curdle into a defiant anger. "You can't just take a person." "I can," he said, his tone devoid of arrogance, stating it as a simple, immutable fact. "And I did. To protect you." "Protect me? You're the one who put me in danger." He turned to face her fully, the glass in his hand swirling slowly. "The men who attacked the restaurant are from the Viper clan. They are my rivals. They are not surgical. They saw you intervene. In their eyes, that makes you my asset. My woman. To them, you are a pressure point. A weakness to be exploited." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Leaving you to your life would have been a death sentence. They would have taken you within a day to get to me." The cold logic of his words was a physical blow, knocking the righteous anger out of her. He wasn't wrong. She remembered the cold, dead eyes of the men in the restaurant. They would not have hesitated. She sank onto the plush white sofa, her fight draining away, replaced by a cold dread. She wrapped her arms around herself. "What do you want from me?" He watched her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "For now, I want you to stay alive, which means you stay here, where I can control the environment." Control. That was the word. He was a man who controlled everything. The thought should have terrified her, but somewhere deep inside, a perverse sense of safety flickered. In a world that had suddenly become lethal and unpredictable, his absolute control felt like the only solid thing to hold on to. Days bled into a week. She learned the rhythms of his life from a distance. He would leave before dawn and return long after midnight, a ghost in his own home. Sometimes she would hear his voice from his office, a low, sharp command in Korean. She learned to distinguish the footsteps of his guards. She learned the way the city lights painted patterns on the marble floors. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the main living area. A single lamp was on, casting a pool of soft light on a credenza against the far wall. On it, among other things, was a single, silver-framed photograph. Drawn by a curiosity she couldn't suppress, she moved closer. The photo was of Ji-young. He looked younger, his face less hard, the coldness in his eyes not yet settled into permanence. Standing beside him was a woman with the same dark, intelligent eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. She had her arm linked through his, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked happy, unburdened. Her name was Hannah. Leah jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Ji-young stood in the archway to his office, watching her. His face was a mask of stone, but his voice held a raw, ragged edge she had never heard before. "She was my older sister," he said, his eyes fixed on the photograph, not on Leah. "She was a prosecutor. Principled. Fearless. She believed the law could protect people." He paused, the silence stretching, heavy with unspoken history. "She was killed 5 years ago. A car bomb meant for me. They used her to send me a message." The wound was there, in the tight line of his jaw, in the bleak emptiness of his stare. It was a chasm, deep and old. He had failed to protect the one person who mattered. Now his entire life was a fortress built around that failure, a monument of control and ruthless power designed to ensure it never happened again. And Leah, a woman he had inadvertently endangered, was now locked inside that fortress with him. Suddenly, his coldness, his obsessive need for control, It all clicked into place. She wasn't just a liability to him. She was a ghost, a reminder of his greatest failure. He seemed to realize he had revealed too much. The mask slammed back down. "Do not touch my things again," he said, his voice once more glacial. He turned and walked back into his office, closing the door with a soft, final click. Leah stood alone in the silent room, her hand hovering over the photograph. She finally understood. His cruelty at the restaurant hadn't been about her size or her worth. It had been about her presence, a soft, unpredictable variable in his tightly controlled world. And now, that variable was living in his home, sleeping in his bed, and looking at the face of the woman he could not save. 2 nights later, the Vipers found them. It wasn't a frontal assault like at the restaurant. It was quieter, more insidious. A flicker of the lights. A sudden, jarring silence as the building's ambient systems shut down. Ji-young's head snapped up from the file he was reading at the dining table. He met Leah's eyes from across the room, and in that single look, a silent order was passed.
Run.
One of his guards burst in from the hallway. There on the floor, they bypassed the elevator security. Ji-young was already moving, pulling his weapon, shoving Leah behind him. The service stairs. Go. They ran. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows down the marble corridor. Gunshots echoed from the front of the penthouse, muffled but unmistakable. As they reached the heavy steel door to the stairwell, Leah glanced back. She saw Ji-young's other guard fall, a spray of red against the white wall. Ji-young didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open and pushed her through, following right behind as they plunged into the concrete darkness of the stairwell. Their footsteps echoed, a frantic, desperate rhythm. They were 10 floors down when they heard the stairwell door above them slam open. They were being followed. "We can't outrun them to the ground floor," Ji-young grunted, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. They reached a landing. He stopped, pressing his ear to the door. He glanced at her, his eyes dark and intense in the dim light. "This is a residential floor. We create a new exit." He kicked the door open. They spilled out into a silent, carpeted hallway. It was empty. He grabbed her hand, his grip hard and grounding, and pulled her down the corridor. He stopped at a random door and, without a second's hesitation, fired 2 shots into the lock. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. He kicked the door in. The apartment was dark and empty, richly furnished, its owners clearly away. He dragged her through it, toward the wall of windows on the far side. "The balconies," he said. He slid the glass door open. The wind whipped at them, cold and biting, 40 stories above the street. The balconies were separated by panes of frosted glass. Their only escape was to go from one to the next. He vaulted over the railing onto the adjacent balcony with a terrifying, athletic grace. He turned, reaching for her. "Come on."
Now.
Leah looked down. The drop was dizzying, a fatal plunge into a river of headlights. Her body froze. "Leah!" His voice was sharp, cutting through her fear. He said her name differently. Not like a command, but like an anchor. It was the first time he had used it since that night in the restaurant. She took a breath and climbed over. Her hands were slick with sweat on the cold metal. For a terrifying second, her foot slipped. She cried out, her body lurching backward into the void. His hand shot out, his fingers closing around her wrist like a manacle. He hauled her forward with a strength that seemed impossible, pulling her over the railing and into the safety of the balcony. She stumbled, falling against his chest. For a moment, they just stood there, pressed together in the dark, the wind howling around them. Her face was buried in his shirt. She could feel the frantic, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. His arms were wrapped around her, one hand splayed across her back, the other still locked on her wrist. It wasn't a gentle embrace. It was possessive, desperate. A claim. He was breathing hard, his breath stirring her hair. She could feel the hard muscle of his body, the tension coiling in him. She had a clear chance. She could push away, scream, run to another apartment, and call for help. She could leave him to his fate. Instead, she stayed. She didn't move a muscle. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by death, this was the safest she had ever felt. He pulled back just enough to look down at her. His eyes, even in the darkness, seemed to burn. The cold mask was gone, stripped away by adrenaline and fear. What was left was something raw, unguarded, and infinitely more dangerous. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the thunder of her heart and the unspoken truth that she had just made a choice. She hadn't run, and he knew it. That was when she made the mistake of looking up, and he made the mistake of looking down. The city lights below were a blur. The only thing in focus was his face, inches from hers. The world had shrunk to this single, terrifying, charged moment.